This is the second part of our Enlightenment timeline. What we did for the first part was looked at the individuals and the basic movements. Okay, we looked at applying the scientific method to people. What's our big cluster for all the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution?
Faith to reason.
Faith, very good. Faith to reason. And we looked at looking at reason and scientific method towards politics, society, and economics. So, who's our biggest society philosopher? It was Voltaire. Very good. Voltaire, his targets, the nobles, kings, and priests. The most controversial of the philosophers? Rousseau, very good. And my favorite? No, Diderot, writer of the Encyclopédie. We looked at people who analyzed the politics. Most famously was John Locke. What's the big key for John Locke that we want to remember? What term? I always remember social contract if you have to remember one, because you're going to keep in mind that the social contract, the people agree to follow what the government says, but the government agrees to protect the natural rights of its citizens. Then we looked at Montesquieu and the three branches. And finally, we looked at the physiocrats and at Adam Smith, people who looked at the economy. Now we're going to do the bottom. Right? These are some more general terms dealing with the Enlightenment, but they are still they're still key concepts. And again, we have not had a lot of Enlightenment questions. I think this is going to be pretty heavy. So first up is how we. By the way, I've got 4 columns in the bottom. The first 2 are kind of big. The last 2 are going to be a little small. So the first 2 are a little big. Now. The first one is how do we spread the Enlightenment? And what is the most important thing that ever happened to make the Enlightenment a success?
The printing press.
The printing press, very good, in 1450. Now, it had to have happened 300 years ago, because the real impact of the printing press was not just that there's more books, it's that what? Yes? Literacy. More people can read. Now, they are reading. What are they reading? Believe it or not, this is the key concept, and it's really easy to understand. How do they get the ideas of the Enlightenment?
They read them.
They read them in books. Where else do they read them?
Newspapers.
Newspapers.
There's a little pamphlet thing.
That's the easiest key concept we have. Also, pamphlets, some bulletins, stuff like that. All right, people can read, but they read it maybe not every day, but every week. The most famous collection of these Enlightenment thoughts, it's mentioned twice in the key concepts, is what? Encyclopédie. All right, write it again.
How do you spell that?
Encyclopedie. Accent on the E. You can write encyclopedia on the AP test, they'll forgive you. But bonus points if you write encyclopédie. Now, so again, a key concept we should have written at the top, but the printing press. The impact of the printing press is finally seen. But our last 3 are the ones that I think they ask the questions about the most. First off, it's not enough to simply read about the Enlightenment. It's not enough to simply read the thoughts of a social contract and natural rights, or 3 branches, or Rousseau, reason and emotion. What do you have to do?
Act on it.
We're not to act on it yet, because we're not going to act on it until when?
Talk
The
about
revolutions, but we have to talk about it. And we talked about specific ways that France especially, but all of Europe, right? Salons is the big ones. The big one. That's what you'll remember the most. Salons. Okay.
Salads. Republic of Letters.
The Republic of Letters, very good. That's where they wrote letters to each other from Paris to Rome to the Netherlands, all the way down south in Italy. But salons are where kind of the upper class, if you get a question about women. That's the change in women roles. Remember, they simply organized the food for salons. Then they did the guest list. Then they came up with kind of the talking points, and then they actually led discussions. So women take a pretty big step forward. Another key concept is, if you maybe are not in the real upper class, the bourgeoisie, you could go to a lending library. You can go to a lending library and get and discuss there. There are 2 other places where you see more of the general middle class go. If you are really educated, or you're a teacher, or you're a student, where do you go?
School.
Academies. And What other era is going on in the background here? We're finally seeing its effects. We talked about absolutism, but that's not what I'm talking about. What other era is going on at this time? What other timeline? Scientific Rev really is finishing up, but still in force here. It's not what I'm looking for. What? What? Reformation's done by now. We've moved on from the Reformation. So how many other timelines do we have? That's not a timeline. It's exploration. With exploration, not only came other lands, one big impact of exploration, not only the creation of this new elite, was new types of goods. What other new good right here is going to create a meeting place where people sit and talk about politics and Enlightenment ideas? It's incredibly obvious because it's still semi-popular today. What new good? Yes?
Is it a coffee house?
It's a coffee house. So when you think about where do people go to talk, you're going to remember salons on the test. You can also think salons and Starbucks. Coffee houses are where regular people went to talk. Right? In the 1950s, if you were going to go out, if you were going to go see a motion picture, and then you were going to go out after and hang out with your greatest pals, where'd you go?
To the diner.
Not the diner.
The coffee house.
No, I forget the name of it.
Theater?
An ice cream parlor, which also served what new and fabulous drink?
Soda.
Everybody likes soda, right? A soda fountain. They called it a soda fountain, and it served soda. Root beer was the most famous. But the last point for spread of the Enlightenment is, if we're looking at somebody like Voltaire, who has targets in the nobility, the kings, and the clergy, what's this going to say?
Fine.
Spread of the Enlightenment we like. It's good. Except unless you are, unless you're at the top of the pyramid who's it's attacking. Censorship. So if you talk about the impact of the Enlightenment, you're going to think of all positive things from this timeline. But you could write an entire paragraph on censorship. Your evidence could be the targets of Voltaire, right? Or the fact that Diderot had to publish his encyclopedias outside of France and then smuggle them into the country. So, other thoughts? Some of this is repetitive, but that's because it's in the key concepts twice. The number one challenger, or the number one target of all the Enlightenment is religion. I write that because it's very similar to the last era, the scientific revolution, right? Even though it goes without saying, we need to say it so you remember it. And the reason is because we are moving from faith to reason. In our last timeline, what's the ultimate embodiment of using reason? The scientific method. And still today, the scientific method can't prove what? God. So it is under attack if we are switching the way our mind is working. But it's not the death of God. Okay? Religion, organized religion, takes a pretty big hit. Because it's really hard to look reasonably at a pope or at a king who thinks he has divine right and say that that reasonably is okay. But people still believed in a personal relationship with God. And religion went a little bit. The Catholic Church is still very strong. It went a little bit from these big institutions to more focus of like your relationship with Jesus Christ or whatever religion you are. For that reason, religion became much more personal and much more local. Does anybody know what impact it had? What is defined religion in Europe in the 1500s, in the 1600s? You said it, Russell, churches, but to highlight, you said, Evan, you said it, Evan, churches, but you're wrong. To highlight a little bit of why you're right, is he said church is, multiple churches. So when we've talked about religion for the last 200 years, what have we talked about? Conflict and violence between the two churches. But if religion is personal, it's really hard to go against somebody else who believes in God. So we actually see a lot of religious liberty. There is less religious prosecution. Because you really need a big organized religions to successfully prosecute or persecute somebody, not prosecute. It's so much so that what group even starts to see a little bit of freedom in Europe? Never happened before. Jews. Even Jews get a little bit of freedom. Okay. The last point for this is I want to talk about the exploration. Now, the reasons for explorations are God, glory, gold. The outcomes of exploration will ultimately be imperialism in colonies, right? Needing these places to trade and compete with one another, and I want to have the most colonies because I want to look the most powerful. Another impact was that we are now coming in contact with multiple cultures, different types of cultures, and we analyze these different types of cultures and all this other junk. But what was there in Europe 2,000 years ago and continues to be there today is racism. Now, here. How is that a key concept if it's always been there? Well, Europe has, and we're going to generalize, Europe has always said, I am white European, you are brown skin or black skin. Why? 200 years ago, 300 years ago, when white European looked at brown skin person, they said your skin is brown because? God. God smited your people. God kicked Ham off the ark, you settled in Africa, and he made your skin black because you're sinners. We are moving on, though, from faith. We are moving towards reason. So now, when we say the reason whites are better than other races is because we're not to Darwinism yet. Darwin isn't until the mid-1800s, but we start to use science, all right? That we are simply better than you, right? Our skulls are better formed and all this other junk. We are using science to validate European racism, okay? So I would put racism scientifically based. We have not had this question. It'll happen sometime. How has racism changed in European history? Okay? And you're going to talk simply about three things. Religion, scientific and Darwinism, and then modern day, most of the anger since 1871 is over what? Not immigration, but you're really close. There is still scientific and Darwinism. There is still religion, but what's the third player? That's a more modern. It's the word that defines modern Europe since 1871. Nationalism or nationality. Okay. Our last two are really, really simple. You can make this column really, really, really small because it's we talked about it in an earlier timeline, but I want to reference it again here. We are seeing the end in France. We are seeing the end of absolutism. In England, we are seeing a reinforcement of anti-absolutism voice. But some of the Eastern European countries still have absolutist monarchs. But in this era, they get a special title if we like them. What were they? The Enlightened monarchs. And again, some of the names or some of the countries were Prussia. What was the name of Prussia's two kings? Frederick's. All right. Then we had Maria Theresa in Austria, and then we even had Catherine the Great eventually in this era, in the mid to late 1700s in Russia. Enlightened monarchs, what are their characteristics? Well, religious liberty, education. They had economic liberalism to a degree. They're still monarchs, but they're trying to do enlightened things. And our last characteristic starts to come out halfway through in the end of the Enlightenment. And I want to preface, I won't tell you yet, but it's in the background of the Industrial Revolution. Okay? Now, all of the Enlightenment is this focus on reason. And unless you're that radical Rousseau, you focus on using only reason in your life. But the opposite in some ways of reason is what Rousseau said. What? Emotion. Right? That's how this next thing is a reflection of the Enlightenment. Okay? Do you know what the next thing is? The last thing for this timeline. Romanticism. I told you to remember one word with Romanticism. What was it?
Personal.
Emotion. Now, that's how it's a reflection of the Enlightenment. How is Romanticism a reflection of the growing Industrial Revolution? During the French Rev, was the heights. Was one of the heights of Romanticism. Do you remember? Can you picture some of the paintings in the French Rev? Lady Liberty leading the people. Eugene Delacroix. The dude with the flag. We saw even the most famous portrait of Napoleon Bonaparte. Remember him on horseback, cape flowing in the wind. What's he doing in that painting? Do you remember?
Carrying a stick.
No. He's crossing the Alps. Very good. Okay, that's a reflection of the emotion in this, right? In the Industrial Revolution, what do you think of when you think of the Industrial Revolution? Pollution, right? Factories, disgusting bad cities. What's some of the other romantic paintings that you remember?
Oh, like the bad one.
Pictures.
Do you remember, for example, Turner and Constable? Okay. Constable painted. What's the opposite of the urban city?
It's the one with
The outside.
the giant field with the field of
It's the countryside. Constable painted the countrysides, and he'd have a nice little peasant guy leaning back in the countryside and looking out over the over everybody. Turner painted seascapes. Do you remember looking at pictures of clouds rolling in and waves up high, and there was always some guy drowning in the corner, so we felt bad for him? Romanticism was the argument against that. Okay, there's also all the romantic artists and composers. We've studied that a lot. It's still something you need to know, but I don't write them all individually on my timeline. Okay.